Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Crouch and I'm Carbon Management Discipline Lead at Mott MacDonald. Welcome to Carbon Crunch. I'll be your host during today's webinar and we're delighted to welcome you all. This is the 9th annual Carbon Crunch and it's the second event that we've held online. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I know that some of you have joined us before, either at the ICE, the Institute of Civil Engineers in London since 2013, or during last year's virtual event. But welcome also to those of you who are joining Carbon Crunch for the first time. Carbon Crunch, we aim to focus on practical steps for infrastructure carbon reduction by hosting discussions and sharing best practice. We've got a lot of great content in the next hour and the rest of the week. Today's webinar recognises the need to accelerate change in decarbonising infrastructure. And during this opening session, we'll focus on what net zero and COP26 will mean for infrastructure stakeholders. Over the course of the next few days, the sessions will focus on different infrastructure sectors. Tomorrow's focus is on the energy sector, which of course is integral to the decarbonisation of all infrastructure. Wednesday will focus on transports and how we respond to rapidly adapting technologies and needs. And then on Thursday, we'll be looking at built environment with heat, retrofit and embodied carbon under the spotlight. And of course, all of these sectors are interrelated. We need to think about things in a systems way, and that will certainly come through over the course of the week. We're putting registration links in the message function now for anyone who has not already registered. So on to the next slide, please. The themes that we're looking at this week very much link into what Mott MacDonald are doing around COP26. Some of these are shown up on the screen now. We're involved in the Resilience Hub. And whilst Carbon Crunch is an event rooted in infrastructure decarbonisation, we can't ignore resilience and adaptation. We certainly need to tackle climate change in an integrated way. And that certainly comes through in what we'll be hearing today from all of our speakers. Also, we're involved in the COP26 Innovation Zone. We're supporting the Sustainable Innovation Forum with our role having an infrastructure decarbonisation focus, particularly on the energy transport nexus that we'll be hearing more about on Tuesday and Wednesday. We're also hosting a range of other virtual and in-person activities from our Glasgow office, and we very much hope that you can join us at some of these activities throughout the COP26 period. Okay, on to the next slide. So there's a few small housekeeping points that I'd like to go through. So following all of the presentations, I'll be directing your questions to our speakers. Please do submit your questions using the Q&A function, which is open now. And if you see a question which you like, please click on it because we'll aim to answer the most popular ones and get through as many of these questions in the time available. Please also be aware that the webinar is recorded. We'll send out a link to participants afterwards. And in addition, we'll be publishing a report following the events. So we'll aim to capture interesting issues from the discussion today, from the Q&A. So even if we don't get to everything in the call, please do put some comments and points in the chat. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Denise Bauer, who's Mott MacDonald's Executive Director for External Engagement and our board sponsor for sustainability and climate change. She'd like to share a few words to kick off this year's event.
Hi everyone, and thanks Mark. I feel a real responsibility as the Exec Board sponsor for sustainability and climate change. And one of those responsibilities is sharing the urgent nature of addressing the climate emergency, and events like this one and opportunities like COP26 really give a great opportunity to do that. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to Carbon Crunch, an event we've been hosting since 2013. Carbon Crunch is focused on sharing best practice to enable and accelerate the decarbonisation of infrastructure around the world. Climate change is one of humanity's most urgent challenges. The need to accelerate our response has never been greater. It poses immense risks, but also enormous opportunities to create a better world. To succeed, we must transform our social and economic infrastructure, our built and natural environments, and the systems that underpin society to cut emissions as far and as fast as possible. It will be vital to employ innovative new digital solutions, adopt circular business models which place a greater emphasis on reuse and the elimination of waste, and build resilience to the impacts of a changing climate. And we must work together through collaboration between governments, cities, businesses and communities. We can act now to combat climate change and build a sustainable future. At Mott MacDonald, responding to climate change is embedded in everything we do. It's at the core of our operations and essential to the solutions we deliver on projects. We're proud to have been independently certified to PAS 2060, the international standard for carbon neutrality by the Carbon Trust, but recognise there is more we can and should do. We'll keep driving our emissions down in line with science-based targets, and we are committed to becoming a net zero organisation by 2040 or earlier. We are engaged with organisations and initiatives worldwide, such as Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and we're a partner to the Advancing Net Zero programme, which is working towards total building sector decarbonisation by 2050. On our projects, the carbon management systems we use with clients across our global business have again undergone external verification against PAS 2080 Infrastructure Carbon Management Standard. We continue to expand and update the Mawata Carbon Portal, our digital carbon solution, which is being used by clients across a range of infrastructure sectors and geographies. It rapidly models capital and operational carbon in the project's optioneering phase, highlighting carbon hotspots and helping clients to embed whole life carbon appraisal into their infrastructure decisions. To stop global warming and achieve the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement, global carbon emissions must be halved in the next decade and reach net zero by 2050. In developed countries, this requires a transformation of society and the economy. In low and middle income countries, it requires climate conscious development. There are a host of compelling reasons to cut emissions and align with the transition to a net zero world. Whether commercial and competitive, as radical emissions reductions require innovation in all areas of business, or to comply with financial, fiduciary and legal obligations. Net zero is a global goal with which everybody needs to align, governments and businesses alike. The upcoming COP26 summit in Glasgow will be key in developing an effective route map for responding to climate change in the years ahead. With time to act running out, it's vital that long-term emissions reduction commitments are translated into short-term actions. For the infrastructure sector, this will mean identifying where we can build upon existing programmes, learning from best practice in other sectors, and recognising key focus areas where innovation and further development are required. This year's Carbon Crunch will explore the roles and responsibilities of national policymakers, regulators, and local decision makers, as well as asset owners and operators in the climate transition. Whatever agreements are made at COP26, the infrastructure industry must take action now to help secure global net zero by 2050. Carbon Crunch, the pre-COP26 edition, will help you on your decarbonisation journey. I'd like to thank all the presenters who are contributing over the course of the week. I really hope you enjoy Carbon Crunch 2021. Thank you, Mark. Now back to you.
Thanks, Denise. So some of those themes that Denise highlighted there will recur during today's webinar and, of course, over the course of the week, such as the need for urgency and the importance of COP26 and the digital solutions which are vital in unlocking opportunities. Today's presentations will focus on what can be done to accelerate the decarbonisation of infrastructure and highlight some specific initiatives which are already underway to achieve this. So where else could we start but in Glasgow? So we'll hear first from Kit England from Glasgow City Council. Afterwards, Hannah Smith from ICE Scotland will talk us through the production of an ICE Scotland Insights report. Sorry, that's the Institute of Civil Engineers Scotland. Then we'll leave Scotland for an asset owner's perspective with David Reilly at Anglian Water introducing their net zero strategy. And after all three presentations, we'll have the Q&A session. So please start submitting your questions as soon as you think of them. Fantastic. So on to the next slide, please. It's my pleasure to welcome Kit England. He's the Green Economy Manager at Glasgow City Council to begin this year's Carbon Crunch. Kit's going to look at the aims of COP26 and the implications the event could have for the decarbonisation of our cities and infrastructure. So over to you, Kit.
Thanks, Mark, and I'm delighted to be with you and to unpack this really exciting topic. So if you wouldn't mind just moving on to the next slide, please, that'd be great. So Yeah, if we start with COP26 and what it's really about and what it's intended to deliver, I mean, the kind of framework for increasing ambition and action on climate change was agreed at Paris in 2015. And so now COP is really about ramping up ambition. So, you know, there are a set of promises that were made at the Paris Agreement in 2015, and particularly around, you might have heard in the media quite a lot about the $100 billion a year in climate finance. So this was a promise from developed countries to developing countries to scale up the amount of money that goes into financing both mitigation and adaptation. But at the same time, the rules need to be finalised. So we're still arguing about carbon markets, particularly under the Paris Agreement. But the main thing, the other thing that we're really trying to get out of the Paris Agreement, out of the Glasgow summit, is around nationally determined contributions and actually scaling up our ambition and our pace and scale of action. You know, the IPCC report that was released a couple of months ago really showed us how urgent that is, you know, with emissions having to halve globally this decade to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. But I also think it's important, as we welcome world leaders here into Glasgow, to reflect on the fact that the climate crisis exists along a number of other nested and interrelated crises that cities across the world and governments are trying to respond to. So the climate crisis is at the forefront of a lot of people's mind, but along with COVID, and also along with the nature and ecological crises. And, you know, in Glasgow, we've seen it as a result of COVID, but inequality and health crises. You know, these things don't exist in silos. And the diagram that I've just put on the right shows you the difference in life expectancy between the West End and the East End of Glasgow, you know, and between men and women. And it's, you know, it's really, really stark. So we've had these kind of calls coming through from governments around the world of building back better, or a green recovery, or green transformation. But as the place where change happens, you know, there's all the statistics about cities being, you know, 70% of the world's carbon emissions, or the concentrations of climate risks. You know, we're the places where all of this change has to come through. And I think increasingly in the policy dialogues, what you're seeing is a recognition that incremental change within the context of the status quo is not going to be enough to get us through to deliver that pace and scale and that change that's really, really needed. But as I say, cities are pursuing that effort, and if it's successful, that will really mean radical change for the infrastructure sector. And as part of that, my sort of call to action is that actually the infrastructure sector needs to be active participants in trying to bring about that change. You know, you guys have the crucial knowledge and the insights of how delivery happens on the ground and how to design these initiatives. And we really need to be working together to make that happen. Could I have the next slide, please? I talked a little bit about how the status quo is really insufficient for what lies ahead, and I think that this is a really helpful diagram that shows you that quite clearly. What it shows is the emissions trajectories of governments and countries around the world with current COVID recovery plans, and how that gels against, or kind of jars against rather, the pathway that we need to be on to net zero emissions. So what you can see is this was done by the IEA and illustrated by The Guardian, and I took the sort of slide from Dark Matter Labs, which is why they've got the credit there at the bottom as well. But, you know, what we're saying is that with sustainable recovery plans, it's slightly less bad. We're on a slightly less worse trajectory than we were on. And it's nowhere near where we need to be on the sort of net zero emissions to 2050. So we really need to be thinking very differently about what are the mechanisms by which we bring forward the policies, the investment, etc., that gets us to that space. So if you wouldn't mind the next slide, please. There's been a lot of different calls for a Green New Deal that's been going on all around the world, whether it's in America through the American Jobs Plan, or in the European Green Deal, or in the Green New Deal rising movement here in the UK, where what we're starting to say is we know what the solutions are. Well, the biggest barrier that places face is the capacity to implement them at scale and at pace. And recognizing that and doing that in a way that addresses those systemic connections between emissions and climate vulnerability, but also equity and fairness and our economic system. So instead of trying to tackle those things in a siloed basis and separately from one another, what we need to start to do is bring them together. And this is a really great, I've adapted this a little bit, but there's a really great study about the sort of what Green New Deal policies really look like. And cities are facing these kind of different pathways. So business as usual, by 2045, we would see fossil fuel energy still dominating. We'd see continued systemic inequity, poverty. We'd have really expensive climate and health crises. Governments would be picking up the tabs for those costs of poor health and climate impact, and we'd have limited adaptation. Where we are at the moment is more middle of the road, sort of where we're using cost-based policies to drive I suppose, action on climate change within the current economic paradigm. And what that's resulting in is sort of mixed economy in terms of fossil fuels and renewables and incremental improvements in efficiency. It's taking place within the wider rules around systemic inequity. You've only got to look at the Pandora papers that were published yesterday, about one set of rules for one set of people and another set of rules for someone else. And we're seeing marginal reductions in climate impacts and costs. Whereas the Green New Deal at the bottom, which is some of the pathways that we're starting to think about here in Glasgow and alongside many other cities around the world, including through the Mayors Alliance for the European Green Deal, is around a much more integrated approach where you're seeing zero emissions energy systems, focusing on improved equity in health and environmental and social justice and adaptation and resilience at the same time. What that might look like, if we can have a look at the next slide, please. Just to give you some examples, I've been in post for 3 months, so I'm just getting my feet under the table and starting to foster this approach, but we're already seeing a huge amount of new change coming through in the city region. So our Glasgow Green Deal will be the umbrella mission that we have in the city. It's going to be a 9-year mission that's about orchestrating action from businesses, from communities and the public sector and governments all together around that mission of being net zero, climate resilient and in an equitable way by 2030. And we're already seeing large investment come through. So we're talking about a new region-wide Glasgow Metro, which will be £15 billion of investment. We're talking about a retrofit programme for half of the city region's housing stock. We've got a proposal around the Clyde Climate Forest with the Glasgow and Clyde Valley Green Network to plant 18 million trees. We're looking at a region-wide EV charging network, and we just launched last week our Green Print for Investment, where we're starting to think about the wider financial flows of the city region and aligning them in a way which is compatible with the Paris Agreement. And that's seeking over 30 billion of private investment into projects that are happening in Glasgow, not just by the City Council, but across the piece. At the heart of the programme, we're thinking about co-design and delivery and the justice and equity of those, who benefits and who pays for those programmes. And we're supporting it with a systems innovation programme to develop a pipeline of new innovation involving the co-design and transition pathways, our real strong role around market making, skills and our financing as well. So next slide, please. So what does that mean for the infrastructure sector? Well, I've just used Glasgow as a bit of an example, but this is something that is hopefully starting to take root in cities and regions around the world. And if it's managed properly, I think there's some really significant benefits for the infrastructure, sector in terms of growing, in terms of delivery, all of those kinds of things. But there's going to be a number of challenges that are emerging across this piece. And I think it's just it's worth dwelling on a couple. So the first is around stranded assets. The transition is, if it's very quick, means that companies will be owning things that are not viable anymore. There's a discussion in the media this morning about the UK starting to try and build a coalition for phasing out financing of oil and gas projects in the round. And we were only talking about coal fairly recently until China stopped financing overseas coal production. So, there's that conversation is moving very quickly now, and there's a real risk of kind of companies either shelving projects or stopping them halfway through or changing direction, which kind of comes with implications for those involved in helping deliver them. There's a massive skills challenge, and that's because if every city or every region around the UK starts, or across the world starts going, well, let's get serious about retrofit. Most of the workforce that we need to deliver a net zero economy by 2045 is already in employment. They're already in jobs working somewhere. And if we have a massive shortage, then we're going to need to retrain and retool and reskill. And the skill system isn't set up for that. So how do employers and infrastructure providers recruit the people, train the people? And it also comes at a time when there isn't the certainty of demand there. There is not yet a pipeline of projects of investment at the scale that we need that gives companies the assurance that they need to go and invest and create those. The third is climate impacts. you know, actually increasing and future warming represents financial, reputational and delivery risks, and we've got to factor those in. And then I think the wider point that I was starting to hint at the start was what's the role of an infrastructure company in the 21st century and in this space? Is it the same as it was 10 years ago? Is it the same as it was 5 years ago? And I would probably say it's not, because the ways of working, if we think about, you know, times when humanity's created these big changes before, like the Apollo mission, the kind of NASA there instigated completely different ways of working with private sector companies and private sector collaborations, and it's time to think about that again as well. So I've just tried to show sort of some of the challenges that lie ahead and some of the barriers that we need to overcome and that we in Glasgow are committed to overcoming in partnership with others. But I would encourage all of you in presenting and in, you know, participating over the next 4 days to think about some of those challenges and how you might be able to address them as well. So I hope that's been a useful introductory session to set the conversation away, and I look forward to hearing the other presenters and the Q&A afterwards. Thanks very much.
Fantastic, thank you, Kit. Yeah, brilliant start to the session there, and a lot to get our you know, our teeth stuck into when we have the panel discussion as well. So I'd now like to welcome Hannah Smith, who's Director of the Institute of Civil Engineers Scotland, who's going to be talking us through well, some of their wider goals, but also a study that you're currently working on to identify key policy, regulatory and financial measures needed to enable the decarbonisation of Scotland's infrastructure. So thank you, Hannah. Really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about this subject.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and certainly a tough act to follow there from Kit, but hopefully over the next 5 minutes or so, I'll be able to contribute some more to some of these big questions that we're thinking about and share ICE's perspective. Before I begin, a bit about ICE, just to contextualise. Hopefully some of you will know us already, but we are, of course, the Institution of Civil Engineers, a professional engineering organisation, and we have a number of functions, and one of those is on that skills piece to make sure that the people who are out there designing, building and maintaining our infrastructure are well equipped to do so. So we professionally qualify civil engineers. We have some 9,000 on our membership books here in Scotland, over 10 times that globally. So a big international membership from which we draw. We're also out and about in schools, thinking about that future skills pipeline, doing lots of STEM activities, encouraging the right sorts of people and more diverse people to come forward into the infrastructure sector. But one of the other things we do, and very much the lens through which I'm here today, is that we think about infrastructure in terms of the public good. You know, we're not a trade association, we're a charity, we're a professional institution. We see our role as informing decision makers and pulling that expertise through from our membership to help guide and inform the debate. And we do that lots, and particularly for me up here, very much in the context of Scotland. So in that space for us just now, there are really kind of 3 key pieces that I wanted to talk around today. One is resiliency. One is enabling decarbonisation, and the third is delivery mechanisms. And a lot of sort of synergy, I think, with what we were hearing from Kit a few minutes ago, particularly because when we think about infrastructure in that public goods, sort of societal benefit space, we're not just thinking about the assets that we have. We're thinking about what those assets deliver, what their value is for our society, for our economy, and for all other elements, sustainability, our sort of biodiversity. All of this is very much how we are viewing infrastructure as a means to an outcome rather than an end in itself. So I'll take resiliency first very quickly. As has been mentioned, you know, there's an issue with the ability of our existing assets, or large proportions of them at least, to withstand the challenges that we know are coming, even in a kind of Paris compliant carbon scenario, but equally the challenges we see today. And I don't need to labour to anyone on this call and the true impact of that. And even within Scotland, you know, particularly we think around flood risk, extreme rainfall, but even things like wind and heat, increasingly drought. We're seeing these challenges to our existing assets manifest with, you know, an alarming regularity, I think we could say, but in a way that presents a real challenge, because you can't really build upon a wobbly foundation in a sense. So for us, tackling this is paramount, tackling it in a way that maximises the opportunity that's there, that isn't necessarily about taking asset A and going back in and repairing it to the baseline that it was, but enhancing it and making it perform those wider sets of outcomes socially and economically in a way that is better, and making that asset more sustainable. And so big theme for us on resiliency, and right now we really think that we could do with a bit of a resiliency audit across our infrastructure sector. This problem is massive. There is arguably a bit of a challenge around where do you start, and that's what we are speaking to Scottish Government about at this very moment, and do get in touch if you've got any queries around that piece of work in particular. But to pivot now slightly, although clearly very related, kind of item number 2 for us, although this is not in numerical order, I should stress, but is that decarbonisation piece. So clearly, there is a need to do this, and there's a need to do this quickly. And I think that the facts around that have been well established and recognised. But that opens up a lot around the how do you do this, and what are the mechanisms. And when we were thinking about this at ICE Scotland, one of the themes that kept coming forward was the challenge of knowing what is a good intervention at a macro level, at a policymaker level, and what perhaps is an intervention that is useful but isn't quite so meaningful. And I think one of the issues in that space is just the volume of stuff just now. We see excellent infrastructure projects that are decarbonising assets or bringing forward low carbon, more sustainable assets. And in each of those, there are people with a huge amount of knowledge about what has worked and what some of the barriers and blockers are. But when you sort of extrapolate that out to a macro level, that's a lot of data, that's a lot of feedback from on the ground stuff. And that's before you get into what reports are coming out, what analysis is being published. So from the lens of a policy making perspective, there is a huge amount to work through to try and ascertain what actions you could do that would have some meaningful impact and add value. And that's why we've been delighted to join forces with Mott MacDonald to try and cut through some of that noise. So we've spent the last few months now working through, I've got to say, a very robust programme of stakeholder engagement to try and capture some of that data, and then do some analysis, do some difficult thinking to try and give policymakers something that says, look, here's the stuff that we think you could do quite quickly in the short terms of life of this Parliament that would have most impact. And I appreciate that perhaps doesn't sound like the snazziest piece of work in the carbon space that has ever been mooted at one of these platforms before, but I am certainly hopeful that it is something that is a useful contribution on quite a practical level and adds a bit of value. So we're looking to publish this really in the coming months, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. But the third bit of all this, we've had the resilience piece, there's the decarbonisation piece, clearly both very linked. Is the how do you actually get this done? And Kit talked too about the change required at a systems level, and we are very interested in that too, and that's really our third big ticket at the moment, delivery mechanisms. Again, this all sounds kind of policy speak and arguably a little bit airy-fairy, but it's really important that we get the right processes and frameworks in place quickly, and that are different, to make sure that we lock in good outcomes, that we lock in the types of outcomes we want to see for our infrastructure, and so that we have the processes that will let us bring forward the right projects and not the wrong ones. Internationally, this is done in a very different way in a lot of different places, and that's something, again, ICE's given a lot of thought to, particularly with a programme of work we've got called Enabling Better Infrastructure. But even within the UK, we see down south the infrastructure client group. We don't really have an equivalent up here, should we? We have infrastructure commissions elsewhere that have a bit more longevity than the Scottish Commission. Is that something we should be replicating? I certainly don't have answers to those questions at the moment, but for us thinking about those delivery mechanisms, those frameworks, how to do that more holistically so that we are able, perhaps better able, to think through things like health and social impacts as well as economic ones. Again, as Kit was saying, joining these dots, thinking about this in a very connected way. I think that's something that we really need to give a bit of thought to. So no answers, all questions over here at the moment, but very keen to kind of soak up views on that, and we certainly see it as a big ticket item. So to keep enough space for questions, I think I'll kind of wrap up there. I'm conscious when you don't have slides in front of you and listening to someone ramble on is perhaps not ideal, but certainly for us, the three big pieces at the moment, just to reinforce, are resiliency, cutting through the noise and equipping policymakers with some quick decarbonisation wins to help get us moving, and thinking longer term about what some of those delivery mechanisms should really be. Mark, I will hand back over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Hannah. That was fantastic. No, really good overview of what the ICE is looking to achieve there. So we've heard a lot, I think, on the kind of the why and quite a bit on the how, but certainly our next speaker is going to bring a slightly different perspective, coming from more of a an asset owner, asset operator perspective. So I'd now like to welcome our final speaker, David Reilly, who will be outlining Anglian Water's net zero strategy, including some focus areas on energy, offsetting and resilience. And David's spoken at Carbon Crunch before, last year representing the Green Construction Board, and also last year we heard from Water UK on the overall water sector net zero route map. But certainly the work that's been done at a water company level over the last year has really moved that conversation a lot further forward down into some detail, and I'm sure David won't disappoint on that front in illuminating some of us. Thanks, David, over to you.
Great, thank you, Mark, and good afternoon all. So I'm focusing on those two words, accelerating change, and sometimes we can immediately start to look forward. But Mark actually highlighted that Carbon Crunch started in 2013, and that was post the launch of the HM Treasury Infrastructure Carbon Review. And that message in that report is still as relevant today as it was when it was launched in 2013. And the key messages that we saw from that report around leadership, around innovation, and around procurement and commercial models with our value chains as really important elements to deliver a low carbon future. Now that came out 8 years ago. And if we look forward to the next 8 years and those messages that are within there, another key report that's come out recently is a 7-year-on report that was led through, again, Mott MacDonald and colleagues at Arup. And that report is available on the Construction Leadership Council. And it really highlights where we have made progress in terms of accelerating towards net zero position and reducing carbon, but more importantly, where we've not taken action quick enough. So in terms of accelerating change, there is lots of information out there at the moment of where we really do need to start focusing our efforts. So first slide, please. In terms of that leadership position, so Anglian Water have been measuring, managing and reducing carbon now within the water sector for over 15 years. Key elements that come through from this are asking our question as to why reducing carbon is so important. So within the Anglian Water region, we are at risk of climate change through the very flat topography that we have. So we use lots of energy in terms of treating and pumping water and recycling water back to the environment. We've got one of the fastest growing populations in the UK, yet we're already under water stress, having 2/3 of the average annual rainfall. So the reasons as to why reducing carbon are very, very clear within our organisation, but also the fact that we very early on in the process understood the link between reducing carbon and reducing cost. So the business efficiency and the business effectiveness of this approach also shines through. And the screen that you can see right now gives an example of that, where as an organisation we do plot both carbon and cost in assets that we deliver through our investment programme. In fact, we're at 61% reduction in capital carbon against a 2010 baseline currently, and in 2020 we reduced operational carbon by 34% against the 2015 baseline. And so that metrics indicates that around about 79% of the schemes we delivered through the last 5-year investment programme delivered a reduced carbon, reduced cost outcome. So that was fantastic. Our challenge remains, though, how do we get more and more of our schemes into that top right-hand quadrant? But one of the key things to actually deliver that sort of result is that collaboration that Denise mentioned with the supply chain, being open to the opportunities that come our way, and having very, very clear narrative and targets in place. And the targets for Anglian Water over the next 10 years are to be net zero carbon by 2030, and secondly, to have a 70% reduction in our capital carbon from a 2010 baseline. Having credible targets with clarity is a really important first step. And then on top of that, having the validation and verification to have external auditors come in to ensure that what we say we are doing, we can actually have that externally verified. And we do that through ISO 14064, through Achilles CMARS, but also what we call PAS 2080, which I'll touch on in a second. Next slide, please. So on top of the leadership piece, it is all about understanding baselines, understanding where carbon is emitted within the organisation. So before we can go on to that transformation piece and the accelerating change, it almost comes back to basics to understand where those carbon hotspots are within the organisation and where we really need to focus our efforts. So where are the biggest challenges? So in terms of Anglian Water and the water sector as a whole, the baseline, the majority of emissions today are within the energy that we use and the fossil fuels that we use in operating our business. But the biggest challenge going forward are what we call process emissions, and that's the nitrous oxide and methane that's emitted on wastewater treatment processes. There's no technology yet we've identified that fully eliminates those process emissions. So if you're in the supply chain and you are working towards how we reduce and how we eliminate that type of emission, then please speak to us, because the water industry is very, very interested in that at the moment. And in terms of those first steps that we took, next slide, please. As a water sector, so the Water Companies of England came up with a target to deliver net zero by 2030 when we announced our public interest commitment back in April of 2019. And as a sector, we came together and launched a route map to net zero that was released back in November of last year. And that provided us with the direction for the transition to net zero. And it's a great document for highlighting what are the key interventions that we need to take as a sector and indicating those to key parts of the value chain, including government, our regulators, and key parts of our supply chain. In July, Anglian Water used that route map from a sector perspective and released our own pathway and our own route map to net zero, working closely with colleagues on this call from Mott MacDonald. And that really highlights that transition that we require. And I would say right now that, having looked at most of the plans within the sector, it's one of the most data robust and rigorous and credible plans that I've seen out there. So if you would want to see that plan, please go on the Anglian Water website and you can take a look at the detail that we've made very, very visible and transparent in our approach. And in terms of the net zero route map, that really highlights 3 key areas of intervention and activity. The first one is to reduce emissions within our control. That's our key area of focus. So how do we reduce energy usage even more? How do we become more water efficient and reduce leakage? In terms of our second hierarchy, how do we maximise the opportunity from renewables, including solar, wind, biogas to grid, all of the other different elements that exist out there? And building on that, how do we start to integrate energy storage into this equation as well? And then thirdly, something new for Anglian Water that we're now starting to look at, and that is offsets, because we haven't got answers to process emissions, we will have residual emissions in 2030 that we will need to use offsetting. But rather than simply going out to buy the cheapest offset that's potentially available, what we are doing in terms of our strategy is how we work with other stakeholders within the east of England to develop a market and develop the opportunities around offsetting. So we've got an offset that's aligned to our purpose within Anglian Water, and that is to bring environmental and social prosperity to the region that we serve. So that gives you a brief on terms of what our strategy to net zero starts to look like. And within each of those hierarchies, we've got a number of interventions that we are looking and are progressing with in taking forward. And some of those are indicated in the blue box at the bottom of that screen, which indicate some of the key areas of focus around energy, biogas, process emissions, etc. Next slide, please. Now, some great examples, and Kit mentioned the importance of the finance community in the space of net zero, and that's one of the areas of real change that I've seen over the last 5 years. So in 2017, Anglian Water were the first utility to issue a sterling green bond to the value of £250 million. Now that was 3.5 times oversubscribed when we issued that bond, and we've issued a further £800 million of green bonds since that point in time. But actually this summer, we took that approach even further forward by issuing what we call a sustainable linked bond. And now we're looking to raise money through this type of vehicle and this type of instrument, where a sustainable linked bond is linked directly to how we are performing as an organisation in terms of delivering against our net zero ambitions and capital carbon. So if we are able to deliver against targets that we set for 2025 and 2030, then that means that we are able to raise cheaper finance. If we don't hit those net zero targets and capital carbon targets, then we miss out on those opportunities. So aligning the sustainability agenda, aligning that exactly with finance and actually making money work for us in terms of how we invest in our infrastructure is a critical part of our overall net zero ambitions. And again, far more detail on the Anglian Water website if you want to get further information there. And the final slide is around what tools are out there at the moment that can currently help us in terms of accelerating that change towards net zero. So I've mentioned the Infrastructure Carbon Review, the ICR 7-year on report. The other key one is around past 2080, carbon management and infrastructure. And this is a really important framework that lays out all of the different interventions and approaches that are required from an organisation's perspective in terms of the leadership, in terms of setting targets, the governance, the measurement piece, the reporting, the communication, the collaboration with the supply chain, etc. Now, this document is being updated, and as Hannah is probably aware, the ICE are one of the sponsors of updating past 2080, along with the Green Construction Board and Construction Leadership Council. So that is in the process of being scoped out at the moment, and again, Mark MacDonald and Arup as key technical authors of that document. So if you are interested in understanding more about past 2080, or you're interested in the updates that were happening there, then this is a really important document that's now being used globally in terms of allowing infrastructure to understand the steps required for the net zero carbon future that is a collective ambition that we all have. Mark, that's my presentation's completed.
Thanks, David. That was excellent, and I think that point around collaboration across the value chain and the use of past 2080 to help that is a really excellent point to end on. I can see we've got a few questions coming in now. I have also been alerted that that some people are not able to post questions at the moment, and that if you leave the meeting and rejoin, then that may enable that. So you can try that, and obviously we'll try and ensure that the technology is resolved for tomorrow's session. But perhaps to get the conversation going in this final 15 minutes, it'd be good to just go around the panel and ask everyone what you're really hoping for, quite succinctly, just one thing really, to come out of COP26 that will enable your specific, area to really make some progress. And perhaps if we go in reverse order, actually, I'm very keen to start with the asset owner's perspective. And so, David, what are you looking for from COP26, and how will that change the way you do business?
One word from me: action. So we've all got the tools now. We've been talking about carbon for many, many years now. This is down into the action phase. We know exactly what we need to do, and now it's bang on, let's go on and do it. And it's also that link into how we work more closely with nature. So the nature-led solutions piece, in terms of we just can't build ourselves out of a climate resilience issue or reducing carbon. So there's lots of tools available to us, but now's the time for action.
Thanks, David. I'll pose the same question to Kit next.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, I would basically say what David said, right? It's delivery, right? We can't sit at the side and say that we just need more policies and plans now. We have to get on and deliver it. I think the only thing that I would say differently is that the delivery of what's needed for cities and regions needs to look and feel a little bit different. I think with it, we have a much more of a role around enabling and facilitating change, rather than, although we have to also walk the walk in what we do as a deliverer of public services. And therefore I think we need to think a little bit harder about how we enable that, because everyone's got to go further and faster than what Anglian Water are doing, and Anglian Water are doing one of the, are leading in this space already. So that would be my only caveat. So delivery, and us thinking for cities and regions, what that, how do we do that better?
Fantastic. Hannah, same question to you, please.
I mean, so I could cop out of this one by just saying what they said, which is certainly part one of my answer. But I think part two, for a slightly different slant, is hopefully making some real progress on behaviour change. I think, we all know that for some of these sort of ambitions to be met, the scale of sort of personal involvement in it has changed. Particularly we look at things like energy, and we've seen the scale of the transition there. But for your average consumer, they pop their light switch on in exactly the same way. And we know that for other areas of decarbonisation, that's not going to be what the sort of average consumer faces. They are looking at different choices that have more of a personal impact to them. And I think that, the pendulum is swinging in the right direction. I think we would probably all agree, hopefully, that, public awareness is much better than it has been. But I think there's still a way to go in that. And I think COP could be a really good opportunity to try and secure not just public awareness and engagement, but real buy-in from a very broad spectrum of society, which I think is important. And I think that nudges into the skills landscape as well. And I don't want to talk for too long here, but someone said something to me the other day which struck a chord, which was that, well, everyone's job is about climate change now, isn't it? And that came from a friend who is a primary teacher, who had noticed some sort of change coming through in terms of what she is putting out to youngsters that she's teaching. And I thought that was really interesting, really indicative of where people that have not been as plugged into this as most of us in this room are on a day-to-day basis are now seeing. So I think COP presents a huge opportunity to really drive that people-centric approach to this that we know we're going to need.
Thanks, Hannah. Fantastic, and I think that that point of climate change is everyone's job now is a really important point that I know all of us in the industry have been trying to make for some time. But so Denise, be keen to hear your perspective on this, and not just what the others said, please.
Okay, I think I'll go back to the collaboration point, if I may, Mark. Really great opportunity to galvanise across sectors, across countries, across different parts of supply chains, individuals and organisations. It's really a great focal point to galvanise that collaboration. And then beyond COP, what I'd really like to see is just that greater clarity of the kind of wave after wave of action that's needed. We're now in a really decisive decade. Kit made that point really clearly. We even just carrying on with being a bit more sustainable as a trajectory is not enough. So being in that really decisive decade means that actually when we're all looking at what we're doing, whether it's us as an individual or us as an organisation or us as a sector or a country, we have to think, don't we, about what is achievable, what can we all do to be part of that thing coming about, and how can we work together to do it. But it requires clarity. I think about the great clarity that Anglian Water provided with the leadership in the sort of carbon space. And you were really, really clear, weren't you? You set stretch targets, carbon reduction targets, Dave. You showed some of that on the charts we were looking at a few minutes ago. And then everybody sort of kind of aligned around that, sparked innovation and so on. So I think there's a sort of global lesson to learn there, Mark, which we should all be learning from COP2.
Fantastic. Thanks, Denise. Thanks all. So yeah, while noting that we do seem to have a bit of a problem with the question function, we have got a few that have managed to be posted. So perhaps we could all take a look at the question from Angela Gorman, which is thinking about, well, what we might have seen from Greta Thunberg in the last week or so with her kind of blah 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 comments about, you know, are the targets ambitious enough? You know, net zero by 2050. Is this all just sound bites and we're not really doing enough at a fast enough rate? I mean, that sounds like something that Kit would have a view on if I come to you first. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's a range of different perspectives here. I mean, I think she's right fundamentally. You know, we're not seeing the delivery happening at the scale and pace that it needs to be at, and so she's quite right to call people out for that. What I also think, though, I mean, I would qualify that a little bit by saying, well, Glasgow set a net zero target of 2030. You know, the problem with net zero about being 2045 or 50 is that it doesn't encourage you to think about what are the concrete steps that you need to take now and next year and the year after, as kind of Denise was saying as well. So I think she's right. I think what we have to do now is probably set the uncomfortable things of those stretch targets. So, you know, and when I say stretch targets, it's easy to say, but, you know, I mean, if we think at other times in history, those stretch targets probably are going to feel unachievable when we set them now. So, you know, there's a culture of when in the status quo, we set stretch targets and we think, well, I can probably make that. Actually, a stretch target should probably make you think, I have no bloody idea how to deliver that at the moment. You know, in Glasgow, one of our stretch targets is 400,000 homes retrofitted in the next decade at a cost of 10 billion, where we don't even have that as an operating budget as an organisation for a year. So those kinds of targets, we need them, but you know, they really have got to feel like a stretch now. So I think she's right. I think we need to stretch further, but we need to kind of feel uncomfortable as we do so.
Fantastic, thanks, Kit. Would anyone else on the panel like to come in on that one? Hannah?
I'll jump in quickly. I mean, I agree with Kit's point. I think there's a challenge for us all as industry here to articulate the scale of the challenge in a language that's about hope and opportunity rather than threat and fear. You know, we know the scale of the challenge. It is terrifying when you think about it, and you know, to some extent I certainly find myself having to compartmentalize that away to some extent, but we know that there is such opportunity to be had in making the types of change that we need to. So as Kit's saying, we need to be ambitious, we need to be prepared to make ourselves slightly uncomfortable as leaders in this space, but we need to push the language around the benefits and the opportunities for you, for me, and for everyone in doing this, because I think that's the way that will secure the mission buy-in almost across not just people working in this space, but as I was saying earlier, the public too. You know, this is a societal effort, and I think it's a hope over fear piece that will hopefully get us in the right direction.
Fantastic, thanks, Hannah. And David, did you want to come in on this one?
I like the approach of the inconvenient truth and inconvenient truth too, and it's similar to what Hannah said. We can talk about the real challenges, concrete examples of climate change happening around the globe, but we have to also give hope and direction in this space as well, in terms of what are the actions that we need to take. And that's what I saw through both of those documentaries, in terms of they were 10 years apart. But that's what we need to focus on, is what can we do? Otherwise, it will be too difficult a problem, and we'll start to back away from it, and that's exactly what we don't need.
Fantastic, thank you. Just to keep you on, David, there's a question here that's aimed at you around resilience, and so while setting targets for carbon reduction is easier, which I don't know, perhaps we can have an observation on whether you believe that point is true, but how do we go around setting targets around making sure that infrastructure is resilient to future climate hazards?
I think I do agree with the question. I think setting targets for carbon mitigation is easier than climate resilience. However, that doesn't mean to say we don't do anything in that space. So the actions that we take within Anglian Water are, as we're going through our investment delivery process, is to challenge ourselves around the key risks we face, and that is the flooding and the drought scenarios, to understand how resilient are our assets, and therefore does the design meet the criteria that we lay out in terms of our methodology around climate change to ensure that they are going to be resilient. And we've also, within our adaptation report, so that third round of adaptation reporting that we issued back in December, again, that gives us a good indication of approach. I would actually now go a step further than that and say, really, in my mind, climate resilience is more about a systems thinking approach. So it's understanding how our infrastructure interacts with the infrastructure that we see around us. So a really exciting project, and I don't get excited too often, but I am about this, a really exciting project underway at the moment is called Credo, and it's around a climate resilience demonstrator. And what that's basically doing is linking in a number of different infrastructure providers, from water, from energy, and from communication, to understand from a digital twin perspective how we share information to enable us to understand from a scenario perspective how our assets are at risk from different climate change events. That's the systems thinking approach that we need, and that takes us a step forward in terms of really thinking through how we design our assets in collaboration with many other stakeholders.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. Yeah, I'm also aware of that project, and would second that message that it is really exciting. And I think when we talk about digital twins and making it real in solving some of these problems, that's a really fantastic example. We're coming to the end of our time limit now, and I think I was going to ask, really picking up on a point that a few people have made around overcoming silos and collaboration, because addressing climate change is clearly a very collaborative endeavour. I think, David, you've given an answer there around the kind of the digital approach to that, but perhaps Kit and Hannah and Denise could just quickly close out with your perspectives in 30 seconds or so on what we need to do to overcome silos. If I can target that at Kit first, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. I'll give you a quick example. My own post is a really good example. I'm a sustainability specialist, and I've been employed in the economic development team as a senior manager in Glasgow City Council. So a big part of my remit is that I'm bringing my knowledge and discipline of working in the sustainability space and all the collaborations and the practice into the space of what do our economic development functions look like? What do our services look like? How do we think about leveraging green investment rather than normal inward investment? So I think there's some very practical things about changing the way that we structure teams, and who goes where, and those kind of organizing principles, because emissions and climate risk are the product of a system, and the way that the different actors and organizations in those systems are structured gives you different outcomes. And so that for me is fundamental to all of this. Put people in different places to do different things.
Thanks, Kit. And Hannah, the same question.
I think to build on that, stop speaking to the people you always speak to, and speak to a bunch of strangers out there. It's really important to think outside our own sort of industries and sectors, and resist temptation to talk to ourselves and people who share our viewpoints. And we need to be prepared to be challenged and put in conversations that feel a bit uncomfortable and critical. And I think there's definitely the piece that Kit was saying there about the mechanics of moving people around, but I think each of us can probably do something that begins this afternoon or tomorrow, which is find someone that you just think looks interesting and reach out to them and start having a conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hannah. And Denise, I'll give you the final word on this one.
I think there's a thing around actively engaging and leading coalitions with purpose. So we've had our Net Zero Coalition for some time, which a number of people on the call are already engaged with. We're a key member of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. These sorts of coalitions give a real opportunity to dig into challenges from multiple perspectives in a way you don't get if you just keep working on your own. So the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investments bringing together policymakers, government, finance people from all sorts of different backgrounds, as well as engineering community, to talk about exactly the point David was mentioning, you know, the ways of modelling resilience in a completely different way from what's gone before. So I'm really excited about these sort of coalitions with purpose. I know it can look like there's a proliferation of them at the moment, but I think if you focus on some with a purpose which is really clear and put your energy into that, participate actively, you can really bring about change. Thanks, Mark. Thanks,
Denise. And sorry, Dave, for not giving you a word on that, but I think with the PAS 2080 and the digital twins, hopefully that's covered some of that. I'm aware we're at the end of our hour now, so just quickly, but before we wrap up, I'd like to obviously thank everyone, you all for participating and all of the speakers on the panel, and then just link into what's happening next. So there will be a post-event write-up, not just of today, but of the whole week, and that's a really, you know, a nice kind of digestible, you know, debrief of all of the big discussions that are going on today and the hot topics of the day. So please look out for those. Do look out for those COP26 activities that I highlighted at the beginning, and of course feel free to have a look at our new climate change webpage. And then on the next slide, we've got the agenda for tomorrow's webinar, which will be hosted by Caroline Pye, who's our National Grid account lead. And we've got 3 really fascinating presentations that dive into some of the complex issues to do with energy at the moment. So and also thinking about these from a nexus perspective. So we've got National Grid talking, but from a decarbonisation of transport perspective. We've got Piclo, who, for those that aren't aware, really provide a technology solution for players to engage in the energy market in a way that increasingly, you know, asset owners are going to have to and respond to demand side flexibility and engage with the energy market in new ways. And then we've got Power NI, part of the Energia group, who are looking at hydrogen, which again links into that energy transport nexus. So it should be a really fascinating session. It's on at the same time tomorrow from 12 o'clock. So thank you all again, especially our panel, but also all of you for listening. So really enjoyed today's session, and I hope you can join us tomorrow. Bye.